The movie opens in outer space with the starship Avalon on autopilot heading to the colony world of Homestead 2 during a mass exodus of Earth's population. The crew and the 5,000 passengers are all in hibernation pods for the 120-year journey. It is 30 years into the journey. The ship travels through a meteor storm, and power is diverted to the forward shields. Then the ship collides with a large meteor and the power blinks. Red alert screens come on in the control area, then quickly go back to normal. Something bad has happened. Jim Preston, Chris Pratt, a mechanical engineer, wakes up in his pod with a cheery computer voice telling him that soon they will be arriving at Homestead 2. He is told that it is normal to feel confused and weak after being in hibernation. The wristband on his arm is scanned, and the computer leads him to his cabin where he sleeps. The next day he wakes up, tries to decide what to wear when meeting fellow passengers, then makes his way to a cafeteria where he is the only one. He goes to an orientation session about life as a colonist on Homestead, but he is the only one there. The cheery computer-generated instructor cannot understand his question about why no one else is there. Jim goes to the main concourse and gets no help from the information kiosk. He finds an office where he can send a message to the Homestead company that he is warned will be expensive. He sends a message explaining he is the only one awake and needs help, then finds out it will be 15 years before anyone on Earth receives his message. He is on his own. Jim finds manuals for all the ship equipment. He studies the manual on the hibernation pods but cannot find a way to get it started again once the person has woken up. He cannot get into the area where the crew pods are to try and wake anyone for help, and he cannot get into the command area. His wristband does not give him the proper clearance. Jim finds an android barman named Arthur, Michael Sheen, who he can talk to, but the android is programmed to dispense barman advice, like if you don't like where you are, change things. Jim is a general class passenger with a basic cabin, and he breaks into a suite with nicer amenities. A year passes as Jim makes use of the ship's entertainment facilities, but without other people, he becomes more desperately lonely. He goes to an area where passengers can put on a space suit and go outside while safely tethered to the ship. Jim contemplates suicide by opening the airlock without a spacesuit, but stops himself and runs into the pod area. He trips near a pod with a beautiful woman inside, Aurora Lane, Jennifer Lawrence. He studies her passenger profile she had recorded before the ship set sail. She is a journalist and is traveling to Homestead to have an adventure and learn about why people choose to be a colonist. Later he's seen sitting next to her pod, still listening to her interviews. Back in the bar, he's reading some of her work and is talking to Arthur about her writing. He becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation, going to another planet for a better life, waking up early and not getting there, and finding his perfect woman, only for her to be out of reach. Jim keeps thinking about her and starts getting the idea to wake her up too. He talks it over with the android, but he doesn't understand the conundrum. If he wakes her up for his own benefit, he'd be stranding her there with him, to die on the ship. Jim decides against it first, but as time goes by he can't let it go. Until one day, he changes his mind. He goes to her pod and manages to activate it. As she's waking up and going through the same process as he did, he hides and goes back to his room. A little bit later he goes to the main concourse, hoping to find her. And there she is, just as confused as he was a year ago. Jim tells her they're the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. Then he tells her that he can't get to neither the crew, nor the main commands of the ship. Aurora freaks out and wants to get back into her pod. When they get to it, Jim explains that there is no special equipment on the ship that can help them get back into hibernation, effectively telling her that they're stranded. They goes back to the bar, feeling regretful about what he did. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one that woke her up. They go back at the concourse and he tells her that she should rest, since she just came out of hibernation. She feels sorry for him, having to spend more than a year alone on the ship. The next day, Aurora wakes up. She goes back to the concourse and asks the automated info desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there and they go to get breakfast. In the cantina, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him one of the gold class menus. They talk about the possibility to fix the pods, but, unlike Jim, Aurora isn't ready to give up. She searches through the infirmary, then goes through research documents, eventually ending up at the crew's hibernation quarters trying to break the doors open. Jim notices more malfunctions throughout the ship. Sometime later, Aurora laments about her life on the Avalon. She writes, jogs around the ship and swims in the pool, becoming more and more aware of her situation. She goes to the cantina to interview Jim, thinking that his story might be interesting. She asks why he immigrated to the colony. Jim answers with slogans from the company first, but then further explains that he hopes that on the new world he could be somebody, he could build a life. Later, they end up in the observatory and Aurora finally shares her reason to be there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her idea was to go to Homestead 2, live there for a year and come back to Earth, to become the first journalist that has ever done that, writing the greatest story that ever was. Aurora slowly gives up on finding a way to fix their current predicament and Jim figures out a way to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Lastly, he takes her to the bar to meet Arthur. She relaxes for a bit, until she remembers their situation. Jim is left alone with the android, feeling awful about what he's done to her. The next moment he's seen tinkering with something and in the other Aurora walks into the observatory to find a miniature of the Chrysler building he made for her. Sometime later, they go on a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After the dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock and they get into the spacesuits. They go out for a spacewalk together. Jim finally has someone to share that magnificent experience with. Jim switches off the magnets on their boots and they float together in space. They come back inside and immediately kiss, retreat to his cabin and sleep together. Soon after, they start living like a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, sleep together. Jim explores the ship further and finds the hydroponics bay. He brings Aurora flowers. One day the ship passes by a red giant and they go to the observatory to see it. It's Aurora's birthday, so later that night they celebrate it in one of the many restaurants on the ship and then the bar. Jim goes to the washroom and prepares the ring he made for Aurora, while she stays in the bar chatting with Arthur. The android tells Aurora that Jim woke her up intentionally, unaware that he was still to keep that a secret. Suddenly, Jim comes back and she confronts him in absolute disbelief. She runs away furious and panicked. Jim comes back to his cabin to find all her things gone. He runs into her in the cantina the next day, but the moment he speaks, she runs away. Aurora is desperate. One night she goes over to Jim's cabin, punching and kicking him, wanting to kill him. Talking to her over the comm because she keeps avoiding him, Jim tries to apologize and explain his actions to her. He tells her he fell in love with her, but Aurora doesn't care. She can't forgive him for taking her life. One night, as Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction happens. The ship faces a critical error and the main command shuts down. Later, he walks into the elevator and it malfunctions. Aurora walks into the main concourse and sees that Jim has planted a tree there. Then, she goes to the cantina, where the food dispensary is also malfunctioning. Suddenly, both of them hear the voice of the deck chief over the comms, asking who planted the tree. They both run into the concourse and see Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and tell the chief about the situation. He doesn't understand how 3 pods could fail. Mancuso takes them to the bridge and he discovers that there is something wrong with the ship, but the information on the systems has to be checked manually. When they leave the bridge, a robot almost falls on their heads and the two of them tell Mancuso that malfunctions have been happening all over the ship more frequently. He says that shouldn't happen, as he shows them how to collect the data. Mancuso checks on the pods, when Jim joins him there. He's figured out what happened with Aurora's pod. The deck chief finds what Jim did to be terrible. Later, he's at the bridge checking the collected data, when Aurora joins him. They talk about what happened with her pod, but he tells her that he can't do anything about it. Jim walks in with the 16th broken robot. Mancuso feels the hibernation sickness, so he goes to rest, but as he walks out, he coughs out blood. That night, Aurora can't sleep, so she goes for a swim. Suddenly there's gravity loss throughout the ship and she starts drowning as the water from the pool moves with her. The gravity drive resets and she barely makes it out alive. They both run into each other going to find Mancuso. The 3 of them are back at the bridge, slowly discovering what has been going on with the ship. Mancuso figures out that something happened 2 years ago, taking out a major system. They need to find and fix what has caused the failure, because the entire ship is trying to pick up the slack. If they don't fix it, the entire vessel will be stranded. They go to find the problem, but Mancuso faints, so Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary. He's dying and there are no treatments that can stop it or prolong the time he has left. Sometime later, the 3 of them meet in the observatory and Mancuso gives Jim his ID bracelet, tells them to fix the ship and immediately perishes. Suddenly, the lights change to an alarming red and the ship starts shaking. Jim tells Aurora that he needs her help, and they run toward engineering, but there's another failure in the gravity drive. And immediately another one that afflicts Arthur as well. Jim deactivates him. They finally arrive in engineering and start looking for the problem. They find it in the power plant and as they open the hatch, Aurora gets sucked in. The asteroid has caused a breach in the hull in that area. Jim gets sucked in too, but he holds on to the hatch, as it keeps closing on him. Eventually he gets sucked in too, but they quickly manage to seal the breach. Instantly after fixing that problem, Jim realizes that there is more than one breach in the hull. The two of them follow the trajectory of the meteor and find that it has hit the reactor control computer. Jim thinks he can find replacement parts for it. They find the part and change it, but the process of venting the reactor still fails. They do it manually, but it fails again. Jim figures out that he needs to open the vent door from outside of the ship, so they can cool the reactor down. Both of them go to the airlock, and as he's getting ready to go out, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, because he might not come back. She helps him with the suit, and as he walks into the airlock she tells him to come back because she can't live on the ship without him. Aurora goes back to the reactor, where the temperature has hit critical heights. A bolt from the reactor propels into her arm, as Jim is getting closer to the vent from the outside and sees the door. The temperature rises in the reactor room, while he is trying to bypass the vent door to open it. He soon realizes that he'll have to manually hold the door open so the reactor can vent, and he tells Aurora. She doesn't like the plan, but he goes ahead with it and tells her to vent the reactor. She doesn't want him to die and they argue, but he tells her that they have to save the other people and she vents the reactor. The process is successful, but the fumes from the reactor push Jim away and break his tether. The pressure in his suit is dropping too. He tells Aurora what happened and she moves as fast as she can to get to another suit and bring him in. He apologizes to her again. She puts on a suit and flies out to get him, but her tether is too short. She's pulled back, but suddenly grabs onto his tether and manages to pull him in. Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary, only to find out that he's already dead. She uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and to resuscitate him. The medical pod does the work automatically and revives Jim. Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur and they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and tells her that he's found a way to use the medical pod as a hibernation one. He tells her to get inside the pod and ride out the rest of the journey in there. But, as is later revealed, she declines and decides to stay with him, awake on the ship. Jim finally proposes to her and they live out their lives on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon arrives on Homestead 2. The crew wakes up and finds the ship in a very unexpected state. Aurora leaves them a message, retelling the story of the life her and Jim had on the ship while the rest were sleeping. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.